Hello everybody, this is GM Jesse Kraai, and today I'm going to cover round 10 of Carlsen's victory here in Nanjing 2009, one of the greatest tournament performances ever. In this game, he doesn't even need to win the game to clinch clear first. He already has it. Nevertheless, a very fine win, I think, really ending the tournament on an exclamation note. Now, the opening itself I found very interesting. In this position, we saw some recent games with Kasparov against Karpov, and interestingly, now Carlsen is training with Karpov and chooses to play as he did against Karpov. And I think one of the things about training with someone higher rated, or with more experience in this case that Kasparov has over Carlsen, is one often gets a little bit of confidence, and I think that confidence helped him in this tournament. As well as confidence, he also probably got some ideas, and I think he definitely had some ideas of how to play in this position, having spoken with Kasparov probably about it. So bishop f4, and now c6. Notice black would really like to bring the bishop out here, but the problem is if you bring it out here immediately, then queen b3 attacks both the d5 and b7 pawns. So c6 is natural, and now we begin this fight for the f5 square. Bishop d6. So black makes a trade, and we'll see that this trade has some other ideas as well. The first is that the queen comes to a more central square, and the next is with knight e7, he hopes to support bishop f5. So white's going to try to work against that. e3, knight e7, bishop d3. Okay, so this is a fairly standard position, and in this position, black can do several different plans, but white's a little bit better with his extra pawn in the center. However, the real question is not whether white is better, but if this is going to be annoying enough to carry an advantage from the opening to the middle game into the end game. So Yakovenko's next move is fairly typical, but there's going to be some long-term difficulties with it as well. He plays b6, and the idea is bishop a6. So for one, we're wasting a tempo, and two, this pawn we'll see is going to be a little bit fragile later on in the game. Simple move, knight f3, bishop a6, castles. Okay, how could it be more simple, right? Bishop takes, queen takes. And now there's an interesting moment here. Carlsen is now thinking about e4, and in general, most black players, I think, find that the position after DE is more or less okay for them. But there's going to be some tricky tactics that are specific to the position here. Now, castles is definitely an option, but before we do that, let's look at the problem with knight d7. The problem with knight d7 is e4, takes, knight takes, and let's say queen g6, the most natural move. The problem with this is this very nasty queen a3, hitting the knight on e7, and of course now if queen e4, we have rook fe1, and the game's over. So I suspect that Yakovenko missed this queen a3 when he played knight d7. However, let's take a look at castles and see if that would have really helped him so much instead of knight d7. Castles, e4 takes, knight takes. Now, first point is that if queen g6, knight e5 gives white a lot of pressure. And otherwise, say queen d5, rook fe1, there's some very unpleasant ideas involving knight c3 hitting the knight on e7. And I looked at this variation. Knight d7, knight c3, queen f5, using a little trick, hitting the queen on d3, but simply queen c4. And to say rook f8, rook e3, and white continues to have good pressure. Notice in this position that part of the problem is that if the knight comes to d5 now, the pawn on c6 was going to hang after the rook trade. So that weakness on c6 is critical for white's advantage in this position. Alright, let's go back. So after knight d7, e4, I think it's important to sense that psychologically Yakovenko must feel a little bit at a loss here, because all of a sudden e4 is possible, it's allowing e5, and when you miss something like that, that very much hurts a person's confidence during a chess game. So now what he played, though, wasn't all that bad. He played castles. And now e5, of course, comes, which looks very frightening. However, black's position still has many defensive resources here. Now, his next move, I'm not a big fan of. However, it might be playable. He plays queen e6. And I think the idea of queen e6 is he would really, at some point, like to play c5 and have this guy on d5 guarded. However, on e6, e6 is really what I would call the blockade square of this pawn on e5. And a big theme of this game is going to be for white to remove the blockader of that pawn, which wants to advance. And that's a typical Nimzovichian theme, and that's going to run throughout this game. I think more natural would have been queen g6. And let's say queen d2. White still has an edge, but black, of course, can play a number of different moves here. Rook a8, rook fe8, rook ac8. Let's just say this, for example, rook fe8, b4. And white has some very annoying pressure. The game, however, is long from over, and there's still a lot of play. So, queen g6 I felt was more natural, and perhaps better than queen e6, but even queen e6, there's a lot of play here. Rook e1 now is played. Now notice very aggressive intentions. By playing the rook to e1, we are saying that we're looking to push this f-pawn and have our rook activated on f1 behind it. And it's here, I think, that black should really think about making a preemptive maneuver against this f-pawn push and play f6 himself before white gets a chance to do any of that stuff. I still think definitely white's a little bit better in this position, and it's a little scary, of course, to play f6 when your queen's kind of fiddling about on e6. But this at least gives black some counterplay, and in particular it's going to give him some space and liberate the rook on f8. As it was, with rook fe8, it's going to be very difficult for Yakovenko to stop Carlsen's plans, namely knight h4, aiming for f4, f5. Now, of course, Yakovenko would have looked at this move, knight h4, and indeed he did have a plan against it, and that was knight g6. The point is that if Carlsen now plays knight f5, Yakovenko can play knight f4 with a certain degree of counterplay. And also what he's thinking is that if white takes, black will at least have traded off a piece. And with that, when you have less space, when you trade off a piece, that's often a way to get out of some of your difficulties. The problem, though, is that after queen d2, black really doesn't have any counterplay. This c5 move is always done in by the weak d pawn, and it's just hard for black to put his pieces anywhere. So knight f8 was played, f4, here we come. Queen f5, and now very simple but instructive move, knight d1. Now in this position, I think Yakovenko lost his mind a little bit. And I think he should have at least tried knight e6, which would have been more tenacious and at least consistent with his previous play. Now, knight e6, obviously you have to think about knight e3. But the idea is you put your queen on e4, and it's at least a little bit difficult for white to make progress here. And white would have to find the following maneuver. Knight c2, queen f5, and now notice if something like h3, just h5, trying to maintain that blockade. But a very strong move here is rook f2. And the point of this is that the rook on f2 now defends the queen. So black doesn't have much to do. Let's say he plays rook a8. Knight e3, queen e4, f5. And this is the point. Now queen d4 obviously doesn't work, so we can just take on e6. And if knight d4, we have knight f1, and the knight's going to fall. There's no way for the queen to keep in communication with it. For example, queen g3, h3, queen h4, g3. So, black nevertheless could try knight g5, but it's not looking good. For example, knight f1, queen g4, knight g3. And black's not even going to be able to put anything on e4. So this would have also not have worked, but at least it would have been consistent with his prior play. As it was, Carlsen here, or no, Yakovenko played f6. And we'll see that he's again trying to get some space, but f6 is of course going to make a lot less sense now than it would have when the rook would have been on the f-file. Knight e3, queen d7. And now one of the things I really admire about Carlsen's play is, although he's a great calculator, he does have a really strong positional sense. And there's many ways to play this position. For example, you could take on f6 and have a very nice attack. However, this move, queen d3, is very pleasant. It basically tells black that he doesn't have any great moves at his disposal at this point, and that he's taking over the light squares, in particular the square f5, over which we've been fighting from the beginning of the opening. So, not a lot that black can do after queen d3, a very patient move. He took the pawn and played knight e6. f5, knight c5, queen d4. Now we're going to get a little tactical sequence that's very instructive. But before we look at the tactics, we should observe that it shouldn't surprise us too much that white's going to come out on top in these tactical variations, because all of our pieces are really placed perfectly. The rooks in particular very nicely placed behind these two pawns, and the strategical problem for black is going to be twofold. One, these pawns want a queen, and also they want to harass the black king, who is decidedly less secure than the king on g1. So now in this position, knight e4 was played, and that is indeed, I think, black's best chance. Now, did he miss Carlsen's next move? Perhaps knight takes d5. In particular, I think he missed it because in this position, I think he could have put up much more resistance with the move knight c5. So the idea is that the knight protects the queen, gets out of the way, obviously, of getting taken itself, and protects the queen, and the black queen is still pinning the knight to the queen, white queen. I still think white has a very good game here, but it's not very easy at all. And the variation I calculated was f6, rook e d8, knight e7. It's hard to do anything else. Queen e7, queen g4. What I really like about this variation is that even though white's down a knight, these rooks are so well placed behind the two passed pawns that it's hard for black to do anything. Now, queen d7, e6. Now notice, if queen d4 now, we can take and play f7 check and e7, and we're going to be winning with the two passed pawns. So, knight e6. And now rook e6 would indeed give white a fantastic game, but perhaps even better is king h1. And it's not easy for black to untangle himself in this position. And yeah, we could go into this at some length, but actually there's no way out because f7's coming and queen h3. In fact, I think f7 first is even stronger. King h1, and there's no hope for black. It's a little bit obviously tricky. Notice if king h8, then we take on e6, and there's no queen trade because of the rook coming to e8. In any case, clearly this is something that required analysis, and nevertheless, if black just sees the idea of knight c5, it seems like he has to try it because the game continuation is so abysmal for him. The game being queen d5, queen e4, And clearly white's now up a pawn, and these guys are just as strong as they ever were. e5, f5. Rook a d8. Now, a very simple looking move, but one which Carlsen, I think, calculated quite well, and that is e6. The main question on e6 is not so much queen a2, because on queen a2 we can take on c6, and we're threatening things like e7. But what would have happened if takes, and rook d2? The point being that rook f2 isn't going to work because of rook d1. And I think what Carlsen saw was g4. Now we are threatening rook f2, because rook f2, rook d1, king g2 is possible. Rook b2, and now simply g5. And there's really nothing black can do against these pawns. For example, rook b5, h4, king f8, f6, rook d5, and now here's the real point. We'll see this in the game, just king g2. And the king will come up and support the pawns, and at the right moment we'll play something like either e7 or f7 with a winning position. I give a variation in the notes. So I think that's something Carlsen considered when playing e6, which, if you can play it, is the most natural building move for white. The game, Yakovenko tried takes and rook d6, but this isn't going to help much. g4, king f8, g5, king e7, and now an interesting moment. f6 will definitely work, right? I mean, f6 takes, king f8, rook fe1, the beautiful position. But notice, I think Carlsen thought to himself, well, the king's in the way. I don't know really, exactly how it's going to work, although surely it's winning. Instead of that, he said to himself, okay, we'll just play king g2, and we'll move the king up and see what black wants to do with us. The game continued. Rook d5, h4, king d6, king g3, c5, and now notice there's a little difference. The king is now over here, and now Carlsen simply pushed. Pawns are going to be too much. If the rook ever takes the pawn, we can just trade on e6 and play f7, and black will have to give us a rook for the pawn. So in the game, rook d3 check was played. Excuse me, I think takes first, takes. Rook d3 check, king h2, rook d2, king h1. Now the king is out of the way, and e7 or f7 is coming with a winning play. So one of the things that's fascinating about this game is Carlsen won in a style which is reminiscent of when the old masters used to have games called amateur versus master. It looks like black just got rolled over with these blockade, the taking away of the blockade of these two rolling pawns. But I think what this showed is there was, in fact, a lot of depth, both in terms of opening preparation and especially in this particular opening understanding. And that opening understanding led to a nice advantage with the move e4. And with a few inaccuracies on black's part, white was able to make it look fairly easy, and therewith really achieve one of the greatest tournament performances of all time. Carlsen's performance rating in this tournament was 3002. And the big question now, for everyone, all the chess fans in particular, is will Carlsen be able to claim the #1 spot? He's now currently about 10 points behind Topalov, and in the coming Tall Memorial, we're going to find out if he's able to pass him. So this is GM Jesse Kraai. Until next time, bye-bye.